Hello everyone, I'm Multiplier, and this is going to be a guide on spiking in Tetrio. So in your games, you've probably seen something like this pop up on the left side of your screen before. So what does it mean, and how do you make something like this appear if you already do? So first things first, I'm going to go over really what is a spike, right? So what is a spike? A spike is any quick attack of 10 or more according to Tetrio. So if you see that kind of yellow text, you've done like an attack in quick succession or a bunch of attacks in quick succession that dealt a total of 10 damage or more. However, do note that if your opponent cancels some of this off, or they tank some of the garbage before you continue spiking, it won't count as a spike because they just received some of that garbage. All that garbage has to be on their garbage queue at the same time for it to be a spike. But realistically, and when we're talking about spiking, it's just any large attack that you send in a single combo. So when you're trying to spike, always be looking out for clean garbage. This is what's going to be like the backbone of a lot of Tetrio gameplay. When you see clean garbage, it's often kind of your goal to turn this into a large counter spike to send to your opponent. So always be looking out for this. So first things first, how do you turn wells into spikes? Well, you could just wait for Tetrises, right? But not only is the likelihood that you'll get 2 Tetrises in a row fairly small, even if you do get 2 Tetrises in a row, you could actually get more leverage out of that. So how do you do it? Well, you set up a T-spin. So let's get into that. So when you're trying to do this kind of thing, look for PCO or DT garbage. So to set up a T-spin around a bunch of clean garbage, you place a notch first. Well, I mean, you could do this in really any order. But you place the overhang, and then you finish one layer of your stack to complete that T-spin double. It's worth noting that if the garbage spawns on the very left or the very right of the screen, it's going to be much harder to do this kind of thing. So be aware of that. Remember that the reason why we're going to be largely focusing on T-spin to quad here is because the T-spin sends 4 damage, but the quad, at least in Tetrio, will send 6. Because it has the 4 damage from just the Tetris, plus 1 damage from back-to-back, and another damage from the multiplier combo system, which I will be going over later. So remember that this kind of attack is huge, it sends 10 damage, and it's a very good thing to be constantly looking out for. So let's practice. You're given a board state like this, and you have a queue with an S, J, L, T, and I. Feel free to pause the video if you want to think about it, but try to set up a T-spin over that well. Let's say that we're not going to use the hold here. So I can place that S piece on the left, and that creates the overhang that I mentioned earlier. Now all that's left is to finish up the stack on the right side. So I'll use my remaining pieces to do exactly that. I'll place the J piece on the right, and then an L piece right there. Now my stack is complete, and I can clear my T-spin double, and then clear my Tetris. And once I've done this right here just sent 10 lines, and that's assuming I didn't have back-to-back at the beginning. If I did, it sends actually 1 more line. So just this attack in and of itself, is huge damage. And that's going to be the board that you have after this, which you could actually use to create another spike. So all in all, this is a great position for your board to be in, and looking for those spikes is kind of a very important aspect of playing Tetrio. So next thing I'd like to go over is counting to 5. So, of course, you've probably heard of counting to 4 before, which is a common technique where you set your stack to 4 so that it's clean after you clear the Tetris. And this is often used to maintain back-to-back. However, in Tetrio, this isn't always the wisest choice, as sending constant pressure, which is the meta in other games, is rather not effective in Tetrio due to counter-spiking. So, why counting to 5? Well, a 5 tall stack allows for T-spin to quad in a very effective way. So if you see here on the right, the stack was like 5 tall, except after putting an overhang over it and then completing the stack, it became 6 tall, which I used to clear T-spin double and then a quad. So keep this in mind. Looking for 5 tall stack or 5 tall of garbage is very useful, and you should definitely be looking out for this. Keep an eye out for back-to-back Tetris or back-to-back T-spin garbage, as this is the kind of garbage that you'll be able to turn very effective using back-to-back. Alright, so let's practice with this. if I have a board like this, what should I do? Well, a natural inclination with this kind of board might be to just put the eyepiece on the right. However, if you think about that more carefully, you'll know why that isn't the case. You'll see pretty quickly after I do this. So let's say we put the eyepiece right there and then the O piece on the right. Not only is our stack cleaner because our stack kind of lowers into the well instead of the other way around, which is generally good practice. Also, you'll notice after I place this overhang here and I clear the T-spin double as well as the Tetris, my stack after this is actually very clean, right? After I do this Tetris, I could very easily create yet another overhang and another T-spin. So, generally speaking, if at all possible, try to keep the stack for the T-spin double fairly flat. Alright, next thing I'd like to go over would be donations. And this is going to be a little bit more complicated than the previous topics mentioned, but all in all, it's still very much worth going over. So donation is a T-spin in which your stack is in the air. You'll see what I mean in the following slide. So you'll see here on the left image, the S piece the S piece has the donated stack, and the O piece on the right is the donated stack. So those are two situations in which you might do donations. However, of course, this doesn't always apply. There are situations in which you might have to do something different from this, but you'll still be able to score a donation. Nonetheless, it's important to look for opportunities to put donated stack above well. Keep in mind that the O piece is probably going to be the most common piece that you do this with due to its, well, frankly, obviously, square shape. And remember that it's okay to stack above your well as long as your board state is good. Now, if it's not, and you have holes in your board or something else, it's a better idea to just focus purely on getting to the bottom of your board and keeping things clean. But if your board state is good as is, be sure to look for donations as these can get you good spikes. Also remember that a T-spin single, even though of course not as effective as a T-spin double, is still good. A T-spin single into a Tetris will send 8 lines instead of 10, but nonetheless this is still a good amount of damage and it's definitely something you should be looking out for. So let's practice the donation vision. So if I have a board like this, and I have S, C, O, T, and I, if at all possible, right, I'd rather use that T and I piece to do my spike. So what is the best way of doing this? Well, first things first, I'm going to place an overhang here with the S piece. And now I want to complete the stack, and in order to score that T-spin double, I need to do a donation. So I'll place the Z piece here, and the O piece here. Now I've formed a donation with the O piece above the well. Now that I've done this, I can do my spike. So T-spin double into Tetris. You'll notice a lot of the time that T-spin double into Tetris is a very, very, very useful attacking tool. And this is a constant theme that you'll see in a lot of high-level matches. So it's good to try to emulate it if at all possible. Next thing I want to go over is floating T-spins. So floating T-spins is basically a T-spin when your slot is in the air. So what is the slot? It's basically the place where you directly put your T-piece. So in these kinds of scenarios, you'll see I perform floating T-spin on the left using an L piece, and you'll notice that the slot is basically what the T-piece falls onto and spins on. So it's good to look out for these if at all possible, as these are other kinds of setups that will clear up your garbage hole immediately after performing them. So try to look for 3 wide gaps, especially right on top of the garbage hole. Technically, in most of these situations, they're called STMB cave, but that's merely a technicality. I think the most important way to do this is just look for 3 wide gaps and use your S and Z pieces to try to create a floating T-spin. What you'll see on the right is a version of that. Also, it's a good idea to look for uneven 2 wide gaps, such as on the left, where I have kind of a 2 wide stack there, but one side is shorter than the other side. That's when you can use an L or J piece to perform a floating T-spin. As with donations, only consider this if your board state is good or you need to immediately cancel, because otherwise, their chances are not worth it. So let's practice these. If I have a stack like this, what should I do? I see I have a plethora of S and Z pieces there in my queue, so I can try to use these to their fullest extent. So in order to do this, if I know that if I try to use the Z piece for that floating T-spin, I cannot complete the overhang, right? Because if I do that, my overhang would have to go on the right, but that's not possible. So I have to use the S piece to do that. So I'm going to use the S piece to make the floating T-spin slot. And now I have a Z, L, and Z piece to do this with, as I want to be able to use the T for the T-spin. I have a Z-piece here, and I'm going to place that vertically for an overhang. And now all I have to do is complete the stack. So I'll place the L piece there, and the Z piece there. And now that I have this, I can perform my floating T-spin. There are other ways of spiking too. T-spin to Tetris isn't the only way, so we're going to be going over some double T-spin setups. So double T-spin setups are effective as if you hold T and you get 2 T-pieces consecutively, you will be able to execute a 10 spike with only 4 lines, which is incredibly efficient. I'd say the best of these double T-spin setups is probably Fractal in Tetrio, due to the well staying open. I'll be going over this in the next slide. Keep in mind that if you are able to do these, that your efficiency will be drastically improved, and your attack per piece will go up quite a lot. So first, let's go over Fractal. So the Fractal is basically having 2 T-spins right on top of each other. In order to form these, look for a perfect funnel or triangular valley, as you see on the right. And in that kind of situation, I use S and Z pieces to create the top T-spin. If that's not at all possible, then you can consider using J or L pieces to do the same. As you see on the left, I used an L and J piece to form that top T-spin. If at all possible, even though it may feel natural, try not to use T to build the fractal, as that will often ruin your stack and force you to cycle to the next T, which will waste a lot of your time as well as possibly put you in danger for an attack. The benefit of Fractal is that it keeps your well open, so if you receive an I piece early before your T piece, you can still spike, as you can do Tetris into T-spin instead. Do know that if you are able to pull this off, you can pull off a huge spike of up to 17. So if you are able to do this, this is incredibly effective. The next one I'd like to go over is the Super T-spin double, or STSD. So for the Super T-spin double, there are a couple ways of forming it, but the primary 2 ways that I see are looking for square-shaped holes. So as you see on the right side, I have a square-shaped hole at the bottom, and I use an I piece, 2 L pieces, 2 J pieces, and an S piece in order to form the Super T-spin double. While this, of course, is a practical setup, it can ruin your stack if cycling to your T piece takes too long, so be aware of this, and it also does block your well too, so there is some risk in going for these. However, there's another way of setting it up too. You can use your L and J piece, such as on the left, to create this STSD. Importantly, look for a flat 3-wide gap at the bottom of your board, as that can often be a case where you can use your L and J piece to create an STSD. However, also do remember that this setup can be ruined by garbage RNG sometimes. There's a 1 in 10 chance that garbage will spawn directly underneath your STSD, and this will result in your T-piece not being able to spin properly, and it will drop through, resulting in a failure. However, nonetheless, there are techniques to get around this. Do consider looking at Garbo's guide for this, as he goes into the STSD in more detail. There are also some other setups too, though I'd say less practical than the ones I just went over. There's the cut copy, in which you use the stack of 1 T-spin to make the overhang for the next one. So in this kind of situation, if I had 2 T-pieces, I would be able to do this. Know that when you're looking for cut copy situations, you should try to look for an MKO-like stack. And when I'm saying MKO-like stack, I'm referring to this 3-wide gap to make the floating, as well as the T-spin on the bottom. So if you are able to see something like this, this would be very useful to use in your games. The next setup I'd like to go over is the Kaidan or S-prop. So these are two setups that are very useful for garbage that spawns on the very left or the very right of your screen. And these are situations in which you'd otherwise likely not be able to put out very much damage. So these are very useful setups. The Kaidan is useful for diagonal edges in your stack that lead to a sidewell. So such as on the right, you should be looking for a diagonal edge. So you see that just because I have that diagonal edge, all I have to do is place an S piece and then an overhang of some kind, and I'm able to clear a T-spin. After this, my well would be open, and I'll be able to clear a Tetris as well, leading to a spike. On the left side, I have a Kaidan. On the left side, I actually have an S-prop. And what the S-prop does is very similar to what the Kaidan does, only that in this kind of situation, you want to be looking for 2 tall stacks that are 3 blocks away from the left or 3 blocks away from the right. These two are very similar to each other, so the terminology isn't really all that important. Just know that if your garbage spawns on the very left or the very right, you should be looking out for these situations because you can get more mileage out of them. The next one I'd like to go over is the C-spin. The C-spin is a setup that will give you a T-spin triple, then a T-spin double. Now, while this is rather risky, it will deal 12 lines of damage, which is incredibly huge and will likely leave your opponent scrambling for answers. A good thing to look out for on a C-spin is if you have one block directly above the garbage hole, you can place an L and J piece to form a T-spin triple on top that will lead into a T-spin double after you clear it. So C-spin's rather useful, but also very greedy, so only do this if you know that you have the time to do so. The last one I'd like to go over is the Imperial Cross. So this is a fairly common setup, though I do not consider it as practical as the Fractal or the STSD. So what the Imperial Cross does is it changes the position of your well. So naturally, do not try to perform this above one of your garbage holes, as it will kind of leave you with some stuff that you have to skim. However, the benefit of Imperial Cross is that you can clear a T-spin double and then a T-spin single instead of another T-spin double, depending on the way you do it. So do know that it can be a little bit flexible, but all the same, not necessarily the most practical. Also know that certain situations in which you're trying to build a fractal can be turned into an Imperial Cross as well. Alright, so the next thing I'd like to go over is Multiplier. So this is a Tetrio specific thing, and what Multiplier is really just the combo table. So at least in Tetrio, big attacks that are done at the end of combos will deal massive damage. You can see the damage listed here. You'll notice that quads, T-spin doubles, and T-spin triples deal huge damage near the end of combos. Though, I will say there is some drawbacks, as, of course, in the situation of the T-spin triple, it can be hard to perform, and in the situation of the stack, in the quad, it can still be hard to finish that stack. So what is Multiplier? As mentioned, every line cleared before a Tetris or T-spin double will add 1 damage to the final attack. So in other words, if you clear a Tetris and that's the 6th combo, that will actually deal 10 damage. And that's huge in a lot of ways. Do know, however, that it conflicts with back-to-back, so if you're trying to attack with both, it won't work. However, Multiplier is better for downstacking, but if you're going to upstack for something, I generally recommend going for back-to-back rather than Multiplier. Do know that while many will tell you that it can be very RNG focused, while that is sometimes the case, if you're good at manipulating it, it doesn't have to be that way. You can generally get spikes with 3 or 5 skims or clears into a quad or T-spin. So the first way that I'd recommend going for Multiplier is power or funnel stacking. Now, while traditionally in other games, the stack such as the one on the right is not wise, as if you receive garbage in the wrong areas, it'll be very hard to get to them. However, in Tetrio, that same issue does exist, however there is some reward in going for it. If you stack extra for combo around a well, you have the chance of being able to combo into that big clear, whether that is a T-spin or a quad, though in this case, more likely a quad. So if you're going to start power or funnel stacking, do know that it is fairly reliant on speed, and you should try to only do it when you're fairly low on your board. You should also constantly be checking your queue to see when you should start or continue the combo, and be constantly looking for pieces to activate the chain, because constantly funnel stacking only until you have to let it go is possibly a bad idea, as you won't be able to pull off the combo that you entirely intended to. The next primary way to go for Multiplier is to cheese. So in this kind of situation, I have some cheese garbage over a well on the right. So you can send back Multiplier spikes by clearing the cheese and then clearing the Tetris. So while this does require you to be decent at cheese race or other forms of downstacking, it can also lead to a good spike, and you'll see this also happening a lot in games. It generally works best with 3 to 4 lines of cheese, as this is fairly manageable and isn't as RNG based. However, do know that even if you are unable to get the Multiplier, you still are sending cheese to your opponent, which is still good. So if you do go for something like this, it's fairly low risks. So I'd strongly recommend just looking for Multiplier if you have a cheese kind of situation. The next kind of multiplier I'd like to go over is a T-spin multiplier, which many often sleep on, but don't sleep on it, as it can deal huge damage just as much as a multiplier quad can. So to get T-spin skims, it's generally preferred to use one of these 3 skims, as they are rather predictable, and you can try to manipulate them to get a large combo before your T-spin. So you have the horizontal I skim on the left, which you can do if you have like a 4 wide stack above a T-spin. You have the S or Z skim to change overhang position, as you see in the middle. And also you have the L or J skim to create the overhang on the right. You should be looking for the kind of cheese that will give you this kind of situation. But yes, using these three all together and in the right order can cause massive spikes to be sent to your opponent. So always do be looking out for these. So now that we know how to spike our opponents, how do you defend from spikes? So the first way of defending is generally with back-to-back chain. So even though back-to-back chain is often kind of an underrated technique in some ways, just one back-to-back can cancel 5 lines off of a 10 spike, which will turn it into 5 lines of clean garbage. And as mentioned, it's not exactly all that difficult to spike back 5 lines of clean garbage. So do think about canceling these. However, also know that if you're going to be going for back-to-back chain, you should know proper stacking and try not to ruin your stack in doing so, as it likely won't be worth it. It's also important to know that you should also be trying to use audio cues, as when spikes are being sent at you, Tetrio gives you certain noises and cues. So when you hear a spike incoming, make sure to wait a little bit to avoid pass-through, then cancel with whatever attack you have. The next thing I'd like to go over is cheesing. So this isn't exactly a way of defending, rather than it is a way of preventing yourself from getting spiked. If you really do want to cheese your opponent, you should consider power stacking or funnel stacking just a little bit, and think about comboing when you downstack that stack. Do know that you do not always have to be going for Multiplier. Sending your opponent cheese can get you in a better position. Going for Multiplier can just give them clean garbage that they will send back at you. So if you are able to send a lot of cheese, you will be able to get yourself out of certain sticky situations. Remember that excessive cheese will prevent your opponent from building up a spike, unless they get extremely lucky or jeopardize their field, which means that if the same happens to you, you also will likely not be able to spike very well. Consider canceling this if you do receive some cheese yourself. Next thing I'd like to go over is defending with Multiplier. Now, I wouldn't entirely recommend this, but it is an option. So this is rather reliant on speed to be able to pull off, but regardless, if you are able to get a little bit of a funnel stack and you have a little clean garbage, which also is not always the case, you will be able to cancel off some rather large spikes. Overall, it's important to consider also possibly tanking a spike, as spikes tend to be clean garbage, so if you accept some and you only cancel a little bit of it, you'll actually have a significantly better attacking board than your opponent. So do know that if you're canceling only part of it, it's still very good, unless of course it tops you out, as you will be able to send that garbage right back. You can turn that spike into a more manageable amount of garbage if you do things right. However, if you are building up a funnel stack, I would not recommend tanking spikes, as situations such as the one on the right, in which garbage spawns directly over a very tall part of your stack, are rather unfavorable, and I would not recommend them. If you are in that kind of situation, try to cancel as much as possible. Alright, so that concludes my guide to spiking in Tetrio. If you're interested, you should definitely consider joining our Discord at discord.io/underdogscup. In that server, we have free coaching, we have T-spin quizzes, downstack quizzes, and we also have lectures, such as this one. So, if you enjoyed this, be sure to give this video a like, and definitely check out more from this channel, as we will be posting other lectures here. Thanks for watching.